The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host, Lola Adekanye.
Welcome to Democracy That Delivers, brought to you by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. My name is Lola Adekanye. I am the CIPE Country Director for Nigeria, and I oversee the accountability, governance, and integrity programs in Sub-Saharan Africa at CIPE. And it's such a pleasure to be hosting today's podcast, talking about a very, very timely and important issue, which is the gray listing of Nigeria by the Financial Actions Task Force, which is called FATF. And today, we have no other person than a very experienced colleague to be talking about this with me as our guest, Muazu Umar in the studio. So a quick introduction to Muazu. Muazu is the Director of Policy and Research at what we call GIABA. GIABA stands for the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering for West Africa. GIABA is an ECOWAS institution, and it's described in the industry as the FATF-styled body for West Africa. So essentially, if anyone knows the details about the peer review, which is the evaluation that Nigeria went through, which resulted in a grey listing, which we'll learn more about in this podcast, it will be Omar, who is joining me today in the studio, and he'll be talking a lot, telling us everything about that evaluation and what mountains the country would have to climb to reverse the grey listing and get back in the good books of the FATF review system. So welcome to CIPE's podcast, Muazu.
Thank you very much, Lola, for having me. A great privilege for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muazu, what would you prefer I call you? Muazu, Umar? Which do you prefer?
Yeah, Umar is the one that you will not bite your tongue.
Okay, great. And I think it's probably worth mentioning for our audience that, you come from a very, very well-resourced background, over 25 years of working in the counter-narcotics, anti-money laundering, and, countering terrorist financing space, having worked in the NDLEA in Nigeria, which is the drugs and narcotic preventing body for the country, and then, moving on to do this across West Africa. So before we get into the details, just in maybe 1 minute, just tell us a bit about your career path, how you went from NDLEA to FATF, and maybe even before then, if you started off. I mentioned that it was interesting to see that you're a Chevening scholar, so that's great. But for those thinking about a career in this space, and I really would encourage more young people to think about a career in countering terrorism and financing, just give us a 1 minute journey of your experience to this point.
Thank you very much again for the opportunity. Well, my career is a very haphazard one, I must say. At the NDLEA, I was primarily in charge of international affairs, which meant that I had an overview of what is happening in the counter-narcotics space, particularly by Nigerians abroad, as well as the global counter-narcotics space, where I was deeply involved in the work of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, as well as working with both the UN bodies, relevant UN bodies, as well as the Interpol, in trying to counter narcotics both across the world, particularly as it affects Nigeria and Nigerians. So that was a space I worked for many years. And I also headed the West African Joint Operations on Counter-Narcotics and Money Laundering, which was a joint initiative between the ECOWAS countries to counter money laundering and illicit drug trafficking. I headed that secretariat for about 8 years, which means that I organized joint operations among police forces and other enforcement bodies, and then try to coordinate and see that we are dealing with this issue across the region. and it was largely initiated by Nigeria. And then I was made to head that secretariat for about 8 years before I moved on to GIABA, where I went as a law enforcement expert, and then I grew to become a director of research, and then working with now director of policy. So this is the career path, which is a bit checkered.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Even as checkered as it is, it really does prepare you for, it has prepared you for where you are, So this conversation is probably going to have you draw on the different backgrounds that you've talked about, from counter narcotics, from right front and center of law enforcement and investigations, to now setting policy or discussing, doing research first and then policy. So let's talk about the FATF review system. When countries go through the peer review mechanism, I think you would expect that the countries kind of know what to expect when the review has been done. And since it takes quite a while, you would expect that countries can remediate gaps that, they may already be aware of. But it took us by surprise that, Nigeria was included in the gray list. Fortunately, not the black list, but at least in the gray list is bad enough for an economy as big as Nigeria's. So maybe let's start from the process, the peer review process that, the FATF leads or countries go through. Could you tell us how that works? Maybe just talk to us a little bit about the structures and the reviews that happen. What does it entail? Who does it? How long does it take? And anything else that's important information for our audience to know.
Thank you very much. Again, let me say that I think the first critical thing is to ask ourselves, why do we need to have a global action against money laundering? It is important simply because money laundering is a predatory crime. It is a crime that more or less that is very parasitic, where people who do not contribute to development enjoy development more than those who do. In other words, those who do not contribute to the production of goods and services are able to exploit everything in production and service while they contribute nothing to it. So it's parasitic. And no economy can grow and no society can actually function where you allow parasitic nature to take over that society. So from all angles, money laundering is a crime that needs to be countered by all, because everyone needs to be part of it. And to do so, because it's transnational, and then it is very seductive, in other words, quite inviting for the lesser minds. It means that you've got to work together across sectors, and it's pervasive, and it is all over the place in terms of where it can happen. That means that any approach must be comprehensive, must be inclusive, and must be cross-cutting. And that is why the AML standards are there. AML safety standards are there. Now, the FATF by itself actually functions through the FATF itself, as well as the FATF style regional bodies such as GIABA. So we are 9 around the world, and we cover over 200 countries and territories, including the FATF, which covers about over 30, 35, 36, 37 countries, and 2 groups, that is the European Commission as well as the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. So that is how we are structured globally. And the FATF functions through a set of committees, or what you call working groups. There are about 5 working groups. We have the Global Network Coordination Working Group. We have the International Cooperation Review Group, which is the most popular, the Grey Listing Group. And we have the Evaluation and Compliance Group. We have the Policy Development Group. And we have the Risk Trends and Methods Group. These are the 5 operational working groups of the FATF. And we meet 3 times in a year, February, June, and October, mostly in Paris at the OECD, to review global compliance. So these are the operational wings that feed into the policies as well as programs and activities of the FATF and the global network. So this is generally how we are structured. The peer review mechanism is constructed around countries that are members of the global network, or in particular an FSRB, agree to submit themselves to be evaluated against the FATF standards. And then a group of people from among them, excluding the country to be evaluated, are then put together as a team, usually a team of 5 to 6 people, coming together along with the secretariat to then go into that country and then evaluate the systems, the AML-CFT system of the country, and then to come up with a mutual evaluation report that will indicate the achievements of the country, will indicate how effective the system is functioning and the compliance level based on the standard, and then also make recommendations in terms of improvements that are required. Now, where a country perform below certain standard, that is where the follow-up process, including the grey listing, which is a targeted process, is being engineered. In other words, the performance of the country during the evaluation is primarily responsible for why a country can be grey listed or will be put on a follow-up process that will allow the country to be reporting, so that we can observe and make sure that the country is making efforts to overcome the weaknesses and deficiencies that have been seen during the mutual evaluation process. So this is the global framework.
So that's really good to know, because I was curious about who does and so it's interesting that it's individuals with experience guided by GIABA, for instance, in terms of Nigeria, but from other countries, not from Nigeria, who lead the review process or conduct the review. One more question just to drill down on this would be like the scope. I know that the scope will be really broad, but can you just talk a bit about the scope of this review? I'm sure it covers law enforcement, it probably covers compliance by regulated entities in the private sector, banks and designated non-financial professional bodies and the likes. But what else does it cover? Just give us a sense of the scope of like what areas, are reviewed. And then let's talk about where Nigeria was deficient. Where were the major problem areas for Nigeria?
Okay, then in terms of the standards, the AML-CFT standards, when we talk of the AML-CFT standards, we are talking about a few basic things. Number one is the 40 recommendations, the FATF 40 recommendations, which contains also some interpretive notes for some of the recommendations that explain the scope and scale of those recommendations in order to make it explicitly clear for everyone. The boundaries also are set within those interpretive notes. Then there is a glossary that gives an interpretation of the different terms that have been used within the standards. Then you have the methodology for assessing each country, for assessing countries, as well as the criteria or the framework for assessing effectiveness. In other words, there are two measures of assessment. We have the technical compliance, which is largely dealing with bodies of laws, bodies of institutions and regulations that need to be put in place. So most of this sometimes are just a one-time thing. And of course, you have the ongoing due diligence and the rest of that. Then you have also then the effectiveness measure, which tend to look at these recommendations and say, to what extent then are you effective in implementing these recommendations? So that is the way it works. So that's how it is done. But then let me break it down further to say that the FATF recommendations have 7 basic components. The first component has to do with laws, money laundering law in particular, and confiscation, or what you call provisional measures. How to stop criminals from enjoying the proceeds of their crime. So we have under recommendation 3 and 4, for example, the first actually most critical thing is recommendation 1 and 2, which is dealing with policies and coordination and risks. The fundamentals of the FATF standard rest on the understanding of risk. Everything surrounds a good understanding of the money laundering and terrorism financing risk a country has, the policies around that, and the coordination around that at the national level. So that is the first fundamental thing. Under recommendation 1 and 2, we are looking at risk understanding, risk-based approach, policies and coordination. Then you go to the second component, which is the legal part in terms of money laundering, effective laws against money laundering and confiscation of assets. Then you are looking at terrorism financing as well as proliferation financing from recommendation 5 to recommendation 8. So the fourth component, which has to do with transparency of and beneficial ownership of legal persons and legal arrangements, is very critical because it tries to make us understand who is the natural owner, the ultimate beneficial owner, who also has control, or it may be a different person, but who are controlling an entity, a legal entity, and who are the natural beneficial owners of legal entity. We want to be sure this is transparent enough for us to easily know who these people are, to ensure that criminals are not misusing legal entities. Then we have the sixth one, which has to do with recommendation 26 to 35, and this is dealing with powers and responsibilities of competent authorities. In other words, all the supervisors, law enforcement, and what they need to do to ensure effective monitoring and supervision of the monitored and supervised entities. Then the last set has to do with recommendation 36 to recommendation 40, which are dealing with international cooperation. So this is the way the components of the FATF standards are structured. But this is just technical compliance. We also have a set of outcomes that are dealing with effectiveness. But these effectiveness outcomes are actually mirroring the technical compliance. And the global objective that we seek to achieve globally is to ensure that the financial systems and the broader economy of countries are protected from the threats of money laundering and the financing of terrorism and proliferation. This will then help to strengthen financial sector integrity and contribute to global safety and security. This is the overall objective. But for us to achieve this, we need to break it down into intermediate outcomes and immediate outcomes. So we have a set of intermediate outcomes and then a set of immediate outcomes. We have 3 intermediate outcomes and 9 immediate outcomes. So we actually measure countries against the 9 immediate outcomes, which will then show us how effective a country is. And the measures are simple. In technical compliance, we rate countries across 4 criteria. Is the country compliant, largely compliant, partially compliant, or not compliant? In rare cases, there may be 1 or 2 recommendations that are not applicable. With the effectiveness criteria, we also equally measure countries on 4 standards: whether the system is highly effective, substantially effective, moderately effective, or has low effectiveness. And this will then lead us to knowing whether the country needs significant improvement in its AML CFT system, and that will then determine the extent to which the country can be placed under a follow-up system or under the grey listing of the FATF. So this is the way it works. It's very systematic, and most of the time it is after the evaluation that you can determine whether a country can be grey listed or not. So this is not to say that grey listing is systematic. No, grey listing, while it has its criteria, but in terms of timing, there is no hard and fast rule, because it depends on when the evaluation of a country has been concluded, and then looking at the result, you will then determine whether the country can go for grey listing or not.
Yeah, this is so interesting, Umar. I'm very pleased to learn that there is the technical compliance evaluation and there's also the effectiveness evaluation. And because you're right, you can have the laws and have all the good laws on the books, but how effective are those laws in preventing criminals from running the system and running the economy, because they're able to, move monies and assets and funds around easily. So this is interesting. I'm tempted to ask, is there a fixed combination of technical compliance levels and effectiveness levels that determines whether a country would be grey listed or not. By that, I mean, in terms of the ranking of technical compliance from 1 being not compliant to 4 being compliant on the one hand, and effectiveness from no effectiveness to high effectiveness on the other hand. Is there a combination of those that determines that, okay, this company will end up grey listed? For instance, a company that is in not, or let's say largely compliant, but no effectiveness or moderately effective, will that combination?
Yeah, you are almost, you are like, I wouldn't use the word soothsayer, but I think you are a spiritualist, because that's exactly how it works. There is a particular criteria that is used to determine when a country can be grey listed. Actually, it's simple but complicated. Where a country has 8 or more non-compliant rating and partially compliant rating under the technical compliance, that is 1. And where a country or where a country has a low or moderate level of effectiveness for 7 or more of the 11 effectiveness outcomes. So if a country has NC, non-compliant, partially compliant for up to 8 technical compliance recommendations under the technical compliance, and may also have 7 low or moderate level of effectiveness on the 11 or more of those 11 effectiveness outcomes, then automatically the country will be placed under what we call enhanced follow-up process. Now, there is another criteria which the FATF uses to place the country on grey listing, and there are particular recommendations. There are particular recommendations as well as particular what we call the Big Five. There are particular recommendations as well as the number of performance, or rather the number of moderate level of effectiveness or low level effectiveness that will allow the country to go into grey listing. So there are 2 types of targeted responses, one by GIABA and then another for the grey listing by the FATF. So once you are not able to perform on those critical recommendations, which has to do with 1, 2, 3, I think 4, and then 10, like that. So and 20 and 22. So those recommendations are called the Big Six. And once you are not able to perform effectively on those, automatically you are going to be placed, you are going to be a subject of grey listing, because it is assumed those are part of the fundamentals of AML CFT. So this is the way it works.
This is so interesting, but let's zoom out from the technical details a little bit, because I could stay there for a long time. And it's so interesting because CIPE developed this resource called Ethics First for Companies, and it sort of follows a similar complex but simple. I like how you say it's simple but it's complex methodology for measuring effectiveness of compliance by companies with things like, the AML CFT requirements for regulated entities, for instance. But let's zoom out now and leave some of the technical details and come to the areas where Nigeria fell short. And it does sound like you mentioned recommendation 22, which is one of those preventive measures that I believe the private sector would have a role to play there. Is that one of the areas that Nigeria fell short? What are the areas that Nigeria needs remediations in, and how many of those have connections with the role of the private sector and the financial institutions in the country?
Well, first and foremost, let me say that there are a set of global outcomes that are very low for everybody, for the whole world. And one of this has to do with beneficial ownership, understanding, knowing the natural owners of assets or companies is one area that the whole world is not doing very well. The whole world is not doing excellently well when it comes to investigation and asset confiscation and recovery. So that is more or less global. But specifically for some of the developing countries, including Nigeria, there are other areas that go beyond just those areas that I mentioned. And in particular, with regard to Nigeria, one of the fundamental has to do with risk understanding. Nigeria needs to increase its understanding of the different types of money laundering and terrorism financing risk it faces, and then ensure that this understanding reaches the private sector, the financial institutions. Because if the private sector does not have a good understanding of risks, then the private sector will not be able to adopt a fact-based, risk-based approach, because a risk-based approach needs to be based on facts, and those facts has to do with, for example, what are the main money laundering threats facing Nigeria? Where are they coming from in terms of products, in terms of crime areas, in terms of delivery channels, everything else that constitute a major risk to Nigeria? Take, for example, the extractive sector, where you are having a lot of issues in that area. Take corruption, for example, which is very critical in Nigeria. So understanding how that risk manifests itself is important as a country, and then the private sector will now have a good risk-based understanding of where they will need to put their emphasis on to protect their own individual businesses from being misused for money laundering. So everything is connected from the government to the private sector, but the government has to lead the way in terms of national risk assessment. Then the private sector will learn from that and conduct their own institutional risk assessment to know, okay, this is the national level. Within the national level, what affects me the most as an institution? And then, so the risk area is one of the areas that we expect Nigeria to enhance its capacity, and also in terms of updating the risk assessment, because Nigeria started it, but it conducted only an inherent risk assessment. So Nigeria is expected to conduct the residual risk assessment that will properly guide the private sector. Then, of course, the DNABP sector, that is to say the designated non-financial businesses and professions, lawyers, accountants, company service providers, and a whole gamut accountants. There is a lot of issues in that area, in particular because most of them are not fully into compliance when it comes to countering money laundering. And that area is one area that Nigeria is found to be weak, but Nigeria is doing a lot now to be sure that they bring all these people on board. Then there is the supervision. Nigeria needs to enhance its supervision to ensure that the central bank, the supervisors, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, they are focusing on risk. In other words, when you are conducting your supervision, offside, onside, whatever, you are sure you are targeting the risk factors so that you can prevent the misuse of the sector you supervise from being misused for money laundering. So risk-based supervision is another area that we expect Nigeria to enhance its capacity on, which has to do with the private sector. And of course, there are other areas also. For example, in terms of STRs, the STRs, that is to say, the suspicious transaction reports, we need the filing of those to be based on risk, particularly the non-financial businesses and professions. We expect them to be filing suspicious transaction reports because it's an informal economy and they are the gateway to the formal economy. It means that a lot of laundering could be taking place in the informal sector, so that before the money even comes to the bank, it has already been laundered, in a way. So we must be sure that the gatekeepers are also watching the gate. They are not sleeping by the gate. That is where one of the issues. We want to wake up those gatekeepers to be awake to their responsibility and ensure that they are protecting the gate so that criminals will not just open the door and walk into yes, indeed, and overrun the economy. Then the other area that we are expecting Nigeria to do well has to do with terrorism financing, and then the issue of sanctions, because sanctions are very important. And the more sanctions you apply to the sector, to the reporting entities, the more you are likely to dissuade them from being complacent when it comes to protecting their businesses from money laundering. So overall, this is the framework for Nigeria in terms of where we expect Nigeria under the grey listing to make improvements.
Omar, this is such an interesting list and a great place to stick a pin in this conversation for today, because we've come up on the half-hour mark. But I look forward to us continuing this conversation because Nigeria has a few years to walk through these issues. And, I'm so glad to see that of the few countries in Africa, Kenya, Ghana included, that are working on beneficial ownership transparency, at least, Nigeria's Corporate Affairs Commission has done quite a bit of work there. They have a good number of companies starting to declare their actual natural owners of assets. And, somehow we stumbled on this effort to make the economy cashless and move more transactions to traceable platforms in Nigeria. So some hope that there will be more work to come once the new government is sworn in and things start firing up again in the different ministries. But I hope that we continue this conversation and see how Nigeria gets better and more effective in tracking and preventing illicit financial flows and terrorist financing and money laundering. So I want to say thank you in the last 30 seconds I have. Thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to us continuing this conversation and also to us inviting some of our colleagues from Nigeria to talk about what they're doing with regards to these gaps, these effectiveness and technical gaps that Nigeria has. Once again, thank you so much, Umar, and I look forward to us continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much. Just to say that Nigeria has 2 years between now and February 2025 to prove that they can overcome these deficiencies that I've mentioned. Thank you.
I'm very optimistic. That's great. Okay. Thank you, Umar.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.